Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into something called tort law. You might not have heard of it, but it's this invisible set of rules that's running in the background of our lives, basically deciding who's responsible when things go wrong. Okay, so let's get right into it. Picture this. Some careless driver dents your car. Or maybe a totally false online review starts hurting your business. Even something like a neighbor's tree branch falling and smashing your fence. Right? They're super frustrating real-world problems, but they aren't exactly crimes. So where do you turn? What part of the law actually deals with this kind of everyday mess? Well, the answer is something called tort law. And its whole job, really, is to step in and provide a fix. And that usually means money when one person's actions cause harm to somebody else, especially when there's no contract between them. All right, so to really wrap our heads around what a tort actually is, it's kind of helpful to first figure out what it isn't. The legal world loves to draw lines in the sand, and it's really careful about separating these civil wrongs from all the other kinds of legal trouble you can get into. Okay, so here's the biggest distinction: torts versus crimes. A tort, think of it as a private dispute. It's you versus me, and it's all about getting compensation for the harm done. A crime, on the other hand, is a public wrong. It's considered an offense against society as a whole, so the government, the state, steps in to punish the wrongdoer. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, one single act can be both. So, say someone punches you. You, the individual, can sue them for the tort of battery to get money for your medical bills. At the same time, the state can prosecute that person for the crime of assault to punish them with jail time or a fine. It's two different legal tracks for the same action. And that brings us to the other big comparison: torts versus contracts. Tort law basically imposes this general duty on all of us right from the get-go. We all have a legal responsibility not to harm other people. You don't sign a piece of paper agreeing not to be careless. The law just says you have to be. A contract, though, that's totally different. That's a private deal you choose to make, and the duties you agree to only apply to the people who are actually part of that agreement. Okay, so we've got a good idea of what a tort is and isn't. Now let's break it down a little further. See, the law likes to sort these things into categories, and it usually comes down to three main types, all based on the mindset of the person who caused the harm. You can kind of think of these as the three flavors of torts. You've got the ones done on purpose, the ones caused by simple carelessness, and then there's this really unique category where, believe it or not, what the person was thinking doesn't matter at all. All right, first up, intentional torts. And yeah, these are pretty much exactly what they sound like. This is when the person who caused the harm, the defendant, did it on purpose. They knew, or they should have known, that their actions were going to lead to a certain result. A perfect example of this is trespassing. Now, here's the key thing. The person doesn't have to intend to cause harm. They just have to intend to do the act. So they intended to walk onto your property. That's enough. That intent to do the act is what makes it an intentional tort. Same thing with battery. The intent isn't necessarily to injure, but just to make that unwanted physical contact. Okay, next up is the big one. This is category 2, negligence. And this is by far the most common type of tort you'll ever see. We're not talking about someone trying to hurt anyone here. It's all about causing harm simply through carelessness or, just failing to be reasonably careful. So this all comes down to failing to meet what the law calls a reasonable standard of care. What does that mean? Well, basically, we all have a duty to act in a way that doesn't put other people in danger for no good reason. That driver who's texting, they aren't trying to cause a crash, but because they failed to be as careful as a reasonable person should be, they're considered negligent. And that brings us to our third and final category, which is probably the weirdest of the bunch: strict liability. In these cases, the court literally does not care if you intended to cause harm or even if you were being careless. Your state of mind, it's completely off the table. Irrelevant. So why is that? Well, the law basically says, look, some activities are just so inherently dangerous, things like dealing with hazardous materials or keeping a wild animal as a pet. If you choose to do these things and someone gets hurt as a result, you are on the hook, period. It makes no difference if you took every single precaution in the book. You're liable. End of story. All right, let's circle back to negligence for a second because it's really the cornerstone of modern tort law. And to really get it, we have to talk about this one kind of famous and honestly a little bit gross legal case from back in 1932 that literally changed everything. The whole thing hinges on this one really profound question asked by a judge, Lord Atkin. He asked, "Who then in law is my neighbor?" Now, he wasn't talking about the person who lives next door to you. He was asking a much bigger question. Who in society do we have a legal responsibility to look out for? So the story goes like this. It's 1928, and a woman named Mae Donahue is at a cafe with a friend. The friend buys her a bottle of ginger beer, and the bottle is made of this dark, opaque glass, so you can't see inside. She drinks some of it, feels fine, pours the rest into her glass, and out comes a decomposing snail. Yeah. As you can imagine, she gets really sick from the shock and, well, the snail. Now, this created a massive legal headache. Because her friend was the one who bought the drink, Mrs. Donahue herself didn't have a contract with the cafe. And in those days, suing a manufacturer you didn't buy something from directly was almost impossible. So the big question was, how on earth could she hold them responsible? The court's final decision was, well, it was a game changer. It created what we now call the neighbor principle. Lord Atkin basically said that you owe a legal duty of care to anyone who you can reasonably predict might be affected by what you do. So, that little snail in the bottle, it legally connected the manufacturer to the final consumer. It made them neighbors in the eyes of the law. All right, so let's say someone is found liable for a tort. What happens next? What's the end game, and can the person who's at fault argue their way out of it? Right, so it's not always a done deal. A defendant can actually raise a few different defenses. They might argue something called, and I'm going to try this, volenti non fit injuria, which is just a fancy Latin way of saying the person willingly accepted the risk. Like a football player knows they might get hurt playing the game. Or they could argue it was an act of God, like a totally freak flood, or an inevitable accident that absolutely no one could have stopped. And a really common one is contributory negligence. That's basically pointing the finger back and saying, hey, you were careless too, so you're partly to blame for what happened to you. Now, if those defenses don't work, the court moves on to awarding what's called damages. The whole point of damages is to try and make the injured person whole again. And that almost always means money. It breaks down into a few types. You have special damages, which cover the stuff you can put a price tag on, like medical bills and lost wages. Then you have general damages, for the things you can't easily price, like pain and suffering. And every once in a while, if the wrongdoer's behavior was really, really bad, the court might add punitive damages just to punish them. So when you boil it all down, whether we're talking about a snail in a bottle or a fender bender on the highway, tort law is really just about enforcing one simple but powerful idea. It's the legal system's way of asking all of us a basic question. Are you being a good neighbor? It's the framework that reminds us that yes, our actions have consequences for the people all around us.